Mayamu taramnokchari thabaki pau pizri. Ahanbada Central Agricultural University Imphal Manipur na thoklakpa cherol amagi matung inna ahangba firm khara mensinabagi darkhas kauri firm sing adudi ahanbada Social Sciences Discipline gi chairman unreserved amani ani subda agronomy discipline gi professor Sarul Kastama Sarul tribe ama unreserved anini ahum subda genetics and plant breeding gi oina professor Sarul Kastama Sarul tribe ama assistant professor OBC amani Mari subda plant pathology ki professor OBC ani associate professor OBC ama assistant professor unreserved anini manga subda entomology ki professor scheduled tribe ama OBC ama unreserved ama assistant professor ki scheduled caste amani taruk subda agricultural economics ki oina professor scheduled caste ama scheduled tribe ama OBC ani assistant professor OBC amani Taret subda agricultural extension and communication gi oina professor scheduled tribe ama OBC ama unreserved ama assistant professor unreserved ama OBC amani Nipan subda soil science discipline gi professor unreserved mari OBC ama scheduled tribe amani Mapan subda floriculture and landscaping gi professor OBC ama scheduled caste ama associate professor OBC ama OBC persons with benchmark disability ama Assistant Professor Unreserved ama Scheduled Caste amani. Tara subada Fruit Science ki Professor OBC ama OBC Persons with Benchmark Disability ama Unreserved ani Scheduled Caste ama Scheduled Tribe ama Assistant Professor Scheduled Tribe amani. Tara matoi subada Vegetable Science ki Professor OBC ama Unreserved ani Scheduled Caste ama Associate Professor Scheduled Caste amani. Tara nitoi subda forest product utilization gi professor unreserved amani Tara humdoi subda silviculture and agroforestry management gi professor unreserved amani Tara mari subda post harvest technology gi professor OBC ama unreserved ani associate professor unreserved amani Tara manga subda tree improvement gi professor unreserved ama associate professor unreserved amani Tara taruk subda plant biochemistry gi professor OBC ama assistant professor scheduled caste amani Tara taret subda agribusiness management gi professor scheduled caste ama assistant professor unreserved amani Tara nipan subda agricultural statistics ki associate professor OBC ama assistant professor unreserved amani Tara mapan subda plant biotechnology gi professor scheduled caste ama unreserved persons with benchmark disability ama scheduled tribe amani Kun subda nematology gi professor OBC ama kun matoi subda agricultural engineering gi assistant professor unreserved amani kunitoi subda crop natraga plant physiology gi professor unreserved ama associate professor OBC amani kulumdoi subda food technology gi professor OBC ama unreserved ama assistant professor OBC amani kunmari subda processing and food engineering gi professor OBC ama associate professor OBC ama Kun mga subda food microbiology ki professor OBC ama, kun taruk subda farm power machinery ki professor scheduled caste ama, kun taret subda irrigation and drainage ki assistant professor unreserved amani. Kun nipan subda electronics and instrumentation ki assistant professor unreserved ama, kumapan subda renewable energy ki associate professor scheduled tribe ama, kun tra subda fish genetics and reproduction ki assistant professor OBC ama, Kuntra matoi subda aquatic health and environment gi professor unreserved ama associate professor unreserved ama assistant professor unreserved ama Kuntra nitoi subda fish processing technology gi professor OBC ama assistant professor unreserved amani Kuntra humdoi subda fisheries resource management gi assistant professor scheduled caste ama Kuntra mari subda fisheries engineer gi assistant professor unreserved ama Kuntra mga subda textiles and apparel designing professor gi unreserved ama associate professor OBC ama Kuntra taruk subda human development and family studies gi professor OBC ama Kuntra taret subda food science and nutrition gi professor scheduled caste ama unreserved ama assistant professor scheduled caste ama Kuntra nipan subda family resource management gi professor scheduled tribe ama associate professor scheduled caste ama assistant professor scheduled caste amani Kuntra mapan subda home science extension education ki professor unreserved ama Nifu subda computer science ki assistant professor unreserved amani Nifu matoi subda veterinary gynae and obstetrics ki professor scheduled caste ama Nifu nitoi subda animal nutrition ki professor unreserved ama associate professor OBC amani Nifu humdoi subda Veterinary Physiology gi Professor Schedule Tribe ama Assistant Professor Unreserved amani. Nifu Mari subda Veterinary Pharmacology and Toxicology gi Professor Unreserved ama Assistant Professor Schedule Caste amani. Nifu Manga subda Veterinary Microbiology gi Professor Unreserved ama Assistant Professor Schedule Caste ama. Nifu Taruk subda Livestock Product Technology gi Professor Unreserved ama Associate Professor OBC ama Assistant Professor Schedule Tribe ama. Nifu Taret subda Veterinary Surgery and Radiology gi Professor OBC ama. Nifu Nipan subda Veterinary Public Health and Epidemiology gi Professor Schedule Caste amani. Nifu Mapan subda Veterinary Medicine gi Professor Schedule Caste ama. Yangkai subda Veterinary Pathology gi Professor Unreserved ama. Schedule Caste ama Assistant Professor Schedule Tribe amani. Yangkai Matoi subda Veterinary Animal and Husbandry Extension gi Professor OBC amani. Yangkai Nitoi subda Veterinary Biochemistry gi Professor OBC ama. Yangkai Humdoi subda Veterinary Anatomy gi Professor Schedule Caste ngakpigani Schedule Caste ama OBC ama Assistant Professor Unreserved ama. Yangkai Mari subda Veterinary Parasitology gi Associate Professor Schedule Tribe ama Assistant Professor Unreserved amani. Mahaygi thakna Chairman amasung Professor gi Veterinary Science nataba atopa discipline gi oina doctoral degree fanglabagaloina na chahi taragi experience leibagi manungda chahi nipandi scientist natraga lecturer natraga extension specialist oiramba mioi oigadabani. Veterinary Science discipline gi na Veterinary Science ta master's degree da 55% fanglapagaloina na State Veterinary Council natraga Veterinary Council of India da registered toba amasung postgraduate ki Satra takpiba amasung guide tobagi experience leiba mioi oigadabani. Thagi tolop na level 14 lupa laka magalising nifu mari chanini. Associate Professor gi oina mahigi tagna Veterinary Science nataba atopa discipline gi oina doctoral degree fanglabagaloina na chahinipan gi scientist natraga lecturer natraga extension specialist ki experience leiba mioi oigadabani. Veterinary Science discipline gi oina Veterinary Science ta master's degree da 55% fanglapagaloina na State Veterinary Council natraga Veterinary Council of India da registered toba amasung postgraduate ki satra takpiba amasung guide tobagi experience leiba mioi oigadabani. Thagi tolop na level 13A lupa lakh amaga lising kuntra mathoi chamrini. Assistant Professor gi oina mahigi thakna relevant subject ta master's degree da 55% fanglapagaloina na net clear tauraba natraga PhD degree fanglaba amasung scientific journal da research paper publish tauraba amadi undergraduate natraga postgraduate ki satra takpi bagi experience leiba mioi oigadabani. Thagi tolop na level 10th lupa lising yangkai taret chatretni application fee na unreserved amasung OBC gi lupa lising ama Schedule Caste, Schedule Tribe, persons with benchmark disability amasung nupi candidate ki oinadi fee logzaroi. Application form madu makoi gi website gi download to biraga ningthi jana mention biraga October gi tarik kuntra faubda postal mail gi khutangda makha da piri be address asida thajin biraknaba ningsing jari makoi gi address ti Registrar Central Agricultural University Imphal ni. Makoi gi website na www.cau.ac.in ni. Ani subada Manipur University Kanchipur Imphal na thoklakpa cherol amagi matung inna ahangba fam khara mention nabagi darkhas kauri fam singadudi ahanbada ancient history and archaeology ki professor unreserved ama assistant professor unreserved amani. Ani subada anthropology ki associate professor schedule caste ama assistant professor unreserved ama. Ahum subada biochemistry ki professor schedule caste ama. Mari subada chemistry ki associate professor schedule caste ama unreserved amani. Mga subada commerce ki professor schedule tribe amani. Taruk subada computer science ki professor unreserved ama. Taret subada forestry and environmental science ki professor unreserved ama associate professor unreserved amani. Nipan subada fine arts ki associate professor unreserved ama. Mapan subada foreign language ki associate professor unreserved ani. Tara subada geography ki professor unreserved ama assistant professor OBC amani. Tara matoi subada Hindi ki professor schedule caste ama. Tara nitoi subada history ki professor unreserved ama associate professor schedule tribe ama unreserved anini. Tara humdoi subada Manipuri ki associate professor schedule caste ama unreserved amani. Tara mari subada management memes ki professor schedule caste ama associate professor unreserved ama. Taramanga subada Mass Communication ge Associate Professor Unreserved Amani. Taruk subada National Security Studies ki Professor Unreserved Ama Associate Professor Shuttle Cast Amani. Taret subada Philosophy ki Professor Shuttle Tribe Ama. Nipan subada Psychology ki Professor Shuttle Cast Ama Assistant Professor Shuttle Tribe Amani. Mapan subada Yoga ki Professor Unreserved Ama Associate Professor Unreserved Ama. Kun subada Zoology ki Professor Shuttle Tribe Ama Associate Professor Unreserved Anini. Mahay ki thagna professor ki oina relevant discipline da PhD degree ga loinana yam drabada research publication tara leiraba amasung university natraga college da assistant professor natraga associate professor natraga professor oina chahi tara gi teaching experience leirakpa mioi oigadabani thagi tolop na level 14 ni associate professor gi oina mahay gi thagna master's degree da 55% fanglakpak amasung PhD degree fangaba loinana Assistant Professor oina chahi nipan gi teaching experience leirakpa mioi oigadabani. Thagi tolop na level 13A ni Assistant Professor gi oina mahay gi thakna relevant discipline da master's degree da 55% fanglakpa amasung net clear tauraba natraga PhD loiraba mioi oigadabani. Thagi tolop na level 10 ni application fee na unreserved OBC economically weaker section gi lupa lising ama Saddle Caste Saddle Tribe persons with disability gi lupa chamrini. Online apply to bagi aroiba nubit na October gi tarik kun mangani matam na nubidangi pung taramathoi ga minute yangkai mapan chatpa fawbani. Application ki hard copy amasung mari lainava document sing submit to bagi aroiba numit na October gi tarik kun tramathoi ni matam na numidang wairam pung mga fawbani. Makoi gi website ti www.manipuruniv.ac.in ni. Makoi gi address na The Registrar Manipur University Kanchipur Imphal 795003 ni. Aroi bada National Institute of Technology Manipur na thoklak pachirol amagi matung inna contractual basis ta internal auditor ama lawna bagi darkhas kauri. Mahay gi thagna discipline ama hekta da master's degree da 55% fanglak pagaloina na sarkar gi karmachari oina senior audit officer natraga accounts officer oina chahi manga gi thawpuramba mioi oigadabani. Remuneration na Ministry of Finance Department of Expenditure OM number F number 3 to 25 to 2020 e grade 3A that 9/12/2020 gi matung inna oirakani. Masagi chahina 2025 November gi tarik tara fawbada humfumanga dagi hendaba mioi oigadabani. Application fee na lupa lising amani fee thibigadaba bank na Bank of Baroda ni account maming na Director NIT Manipur IRG ni account number na 60330100000143 ni IFSC na BARB 0 NIT MAN ni branch na NIT Manipur MICR code na 795012007 ni application pisin bagi aroiba numit na November gi tarik tarani matam na nungthil pung ahum ni. Makoi gi address na The Registered National Institute of Technology Manipur, Langol, Imphal, Manipur 795004 ni. Hena aku pamarol gi damak makoi gi website tagi khangbiba yagani. Makoi gi website ti www.nitmanipur.ac.in ni. Matang sa tabak ki pau pibaloy zare khurumjari.